The morning sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the busy city streets. People rushed about their routines, some clutching steaming cups of coffee, others hurrying to catch the next bus. Among them was a blind man named Peter, a gentle soul in his late 30s, walking confidently with his loyal guide dog Max. Max was a golden retriever with a calm demeanor and a steady gait. For years, Max had been Peter's eyes, his companion, and his protector in a world that Peter couldn't see but deeply felt. Peter and Max moved in perfect harmony, a testament to the bond they had formed over the years. People in the neighborhood often stopped to admire Max, praising his intelligence and gentle nature. Children would giggle and wave, and some even whispered to their parents about wanting a dog just like him. Max was more than just a guide dog. He was a friend, a hero in Peter's life, though his history was a mystery to most. That morning, as Peter and Max navigated the bustling streets, something unexpected happened. A motorbike rolled down the narrow lane, the rider weaving recklessly between pedestrians. People gasped and jumped out of the way, clutching their bags and belongings. Peter, unaware of the approaching danger, relied on Max to guide him safely. The biker, a man named Jason, was in a rush and clearly irritated by the slow-moving crowd. Jason had a reputation for his hot temper and lack of patience, and today was no exception. As he sped through the street, he suddenly braked hard to avoid hitting Peter and Max. Frustration boiled over, and without thinking, Jason shouted, "Get out of the way." His words were sharp, but what he did next shocked everyone. Jason dismounted his bike and approached Peter, muttering under his breath. When Max stood firm, instinctively protecting his owner, Jason, in a fit of frustration, lashed out with his foot, lightly kicking the dog's side. It wasn't a hard kick, but it was enough to make onlookers gasp in disbelief. Peter froze, gripping Max's harness tightly, his heart pounding. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. Max didn't flinch. He simply stood tall, his eyes fixed on Jason, as if daring him to do more. Jason suddenly felt the weight of the stairs around him. People murmured, their disapproval evident, but before anyone could say a word, an elderly man from the crowd stepped forward. "Do you have any idea who that dog is?" he asked, his voice firm yet curious. Jason frowned, his anger faltering. "It's just a dog," he said, trying to sound dismissive, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice. The elderly man shook his head. "That's not just any dog," he said, his tone filled with a mix of awe and respect. "Max has a history that would put most humans to shame. He's a hero." Jason scoffed, but something in the man's expression made him pause. "A hero?" he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Yes," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "You've just kicked a dog that once saved lives. More lives than you can imagine. And now you've got a lot to answer for." The crowd grew silent, their curiosity piqued. Even Jason seemed to falter, the weight of the moment sinking in. He looked at Max again, this time not with annoyance, but with something closer to uncertainty. Peter, sensing the tension but unaware of the details, knelt beside Max, stroking his fur. "What's going on?" he asked again, his voice steady but filled with quiet concern. Before anyone could answer, the elderly man stepped closer. "Peter," he said softly, "I think it's time you knew the full story of your guide dog. Max isn't just your eyes. He's a guardian, a savior, and his past. Well, it's something extraordinary." Peter's brow furrowed, and Jason took a step back, his bravado fading. The crowd leaned in, their anticipation palpable. What could this old man possibly mean? The truth about Max's secret past was about to unfold, a story that would leave everyone, including Jason, stunned. But for now, all eyes were on the golden retriever who stood proudly by Peter's side, as if he knew his time to shine had come once again. And just like that, the stage was set for a tale of courage, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between man and dog. What was Max's secret? And how would it change everything for those involved? Stay tuned. The crowd surrounding Peter and Max grew thicker as whispers spread like wildfire. The elderly man who had spoken stood tall, his weathered face etched with emotion. There was a gravity to his words that no one could ignore. Even Jason, still clutching his helmet, seemed torn between curiosity and a growing sense of regret. Peter's hand rested gently on Max's back, his fingers tracing the soft fur. Though he couldn't see the crowd or their expressions, he could feel the weight of the moment. The air was heavy with anticipation, and he was desperate for answers. "Please," Peter said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "What are you talking about? What's so special about Max?" The old man hesitated, his eyes fixed on Max, who stood with a quiet dignity that seemed almost human. "It's not my story to tell," he said finally, his voice trembling slightly. "But I will say this. Max is not just a guide dog. He's a survivor. A hero who's faced things that would break most of us. And if you knew what he's been through, you'd treat him with the respect he deserves." Jason shuffled awkwardly, his earlier anger giving way to discomfort. "Look, I didn't know," he mumbled, glancing at Max. "I didn't mean to." "You didn't know, and that's exactly the problem," the old man interrupted sharply. His words cut through the noise like a blade, silencing Jason's apology. "You didn't stop to think. That's the difference between you and this dog. Max doesn't act out of anger or frustration. He acts out of love, loyalty, and courage." Peter turned his face toward the old man, his expression pensive. "You're saying there's more to Max than I know?" The old man nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at Peter. "You've had him for how long now?" 3 years? 4, Peter corrected. "He's been my guide since I lost my sight." "And he's never let you down, has he?" Peter smiled faintly, his hand still resting on Max's back. "Never. He's my rock. But I always thought. I never asked where he came from. I just trusted that he was trained, like all guide dogs are." The old man chuckled softly. "Oh, he was trained all right. But not in the way you think. Max didn't start out as a guide dog. He started out as a working dog in search and rescue. And before that," his voice trailed off, his eyes clouding with a distant memory. Jason, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "What do you mean, search and rescue? Like in disasters or something?" The old man nodded, his expression brave. "Exactly. Max was part of a specialized team that worked in disaster zones, earthquakes, building collapses, you name it. He was trained to find survivors, to crawl into places no human could go. He saved lives, but it came at a cost." Peter's grip on Max's harness tightened. A cost. The old man's voice grew softer, tinged with sadness. Max was in a terrible incident, a mission that went wrong. He was injured badly. He barely made it out alive. And when he recovered, he was retired from search and rescue. But dogs like Max, they don't just stop being heroes. That's when he was chosen for guide dog training, and that's how he ended up with you. The revelation hung in the air, leaving everyone speechless. Peter crouched down, wrapping his arms around Max's neck. "Is that true, buddy?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Max nuzzled Peter's shoulder, his tail wagging gently, as if to reassure him. Jason, still standing awkwardly to the side, looked down at his feet. "I had no idea," he said quietly. His voice was shaky now, stripped of the arrogance it carried earlier. "I just thought he was another dog." The old man turned to Jason, his expression stern. "There's no such thing as just another dog. Every dog has a story, a purpose. And Max's story is one of bravery and sacrifice. He's earned the right to be treated with dignity, not contempt." Jason nodded, unable to meet the man's gaze. "I get it. I was out of line." He hesitated before adding, "I want to make it right. How can I fix this?" Peter straightened, his hands still on Max's harness. "You can start by understanding that actions have consequences," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Max didn't deserve what you did, but he's not the kind to hold a grudge. Are you, boy?" Max wagged his tail again, his calm demeanor unchanged. Jason exhaled deeply, a mix of relief and guilt washing over him. I'm sorry, he said, looking directly at Peter and then at Max. I really am. And I'd like to know more about Max, about what he's been through. Maybe, if I understand, I won't make the same mistake again. The old man studied Jason for a long moment before nodding. That's a start, he said. But understanding isn't enough. Respect is what matters. Respect for the bond between Peter and Max, for the life Max has lived, and for the fact that he's still here doing his job every single day. The crowd began to disperse slowly, sensing that the confrontation was over. But a few people lingered, their curiosity about Max's past far from satisfied. Peter, too, was filled with questions he hadn't thought to ask before. What had Max endured? How had he survived? And why had no one told him about this before? As the old man turned to leave, Peter called out, "Wait, you seem to know so much about Max. Can you tell me more? I want to understand." The man paused, his expression thoughtful. "I can tell you what I know," he said. "But the full story, that's something you'll have to uncover yourself. And it might not be easy to hear." Peter nodded, his resolve firm. "I need to know. Max deserves that much." The old man gave a small smile. "He does, and so do you." With that, he walked away, leaving Peter, Max, and Jason standing in the fading sunlight. The city's hum returned to its usual rhythm, but for Peter, the world felt different. The dog he thought he knew so well was suddenly a mystery, a puzzle waiting to be solved. As he turned toward home, Max by his side, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There was so much more to Max's story, and he was determined to uncover every detail. What secrets lay hidden in the past of this remarkable dog? And how would they change the future for both Peter and Max? Jason watched them go, and you found respect in his eyes. He knew he had a lot to learn, not just about Max, but about himself. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something better for all of them. That evening, Peter sat on the couch with Max lying at his feet, his golden fur gleaming softly under the warm light of the living room. Peter's mind was racing with everything he'd learned that day. Max had always been a constant in his life, a quiet, steady presence he could count on. But now, Peter couldn't shake the image of Max crawling through rubble, searching for survivors, or the pain he must have endured during the terrible incident the old man had mentioned. "Max," Peter said softly, reaching down to stroke his dog's head. "What happened to you before you came to me? I wish you could tell me." Max tilted his head slightly at the sound of Peter's voice, his expressive eyes seeming to hold secrets he couldn't share. Peter felt a pang of frustration. He wanted answers, but the one who held them couldn't speak. The next morning, Peter decided to act. He called the training center where he'd been matched with Max, hoping they could shed some light on his dog's past. After being transferred through a few departments, he finally spoke to a woman named Claire, who worked in records. "Hi, Peter," Claire said warmly. "It's great to hear from you. Max is still with you, I hope." "Yes," Peter replied. "He's right here. He's incredible, Claire. But I recently learned something about him, about his history." "Can you tell me more?" "I heard he worked in search and rescue before becoming a guide dog." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Claire's tone shifted slightly, her warmth giving way to caution. "That's correct. Max was part of a search and rescue unit before he came to us. But, Peter, his full file is marked confidential. I can't share everything with you." "Why not?" Peter asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "He's my dog. Don't I have the right to know?" "I understand how you feel," Claire said gently, "but Max's case is sensitive. The details of his past are protected because of the nature of the incidents he was involved in. I can tell you this much. Max was part of a mission in a disaster zone overseas. He saved lives, Peter. But he also witnessed things that no living being, human or animal, should ever have to see." Peter's throat tightened. "Witnessed things? What does that mean?" Claire hesitated again. "I'm sorry, Peter. That's all I can say. But I can assure you, Max was chosen to be a guide dog because of his incredible resilience and his ability to form deep, trusting bonds. He was a hero long before he came into your life. Peter thanked Claire and ended the call, but her words left him unsettled. What had Max witnessed? What had he endured to earn the title of hero? And why was his past being kept hidden? Meanwhile, Jason couldn't get Max out of his mind. The encounter with Peter and the old man had shaken him more than he cared to admit. He'd spent years carrying a chip on his shoulder, acting like the world owed him something. But now, for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something different. Guilt, maybe, or the need to make amends. Jason decided to visit the same street where he'd encountered Peter and Max, hoping to find them again. It wasn't long before he spotted them near a small park, Peter sitting on a bench with Max lying calmly at his feet. Taking a deep breath, Jason approached. "Hey," he said awkwardly. Peter turned his head toward the voice. "Jason, right?" "Yeah," Jason said, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "I just wanted to say, I've been thinking about what happened, about what I did, and I'm sorry. Really, I was a jerk, and I shouldn't have taken my frustration out on Max." Peter nodded slowly. "I appreciate that," he said, "but saying sorry is one thing. Changing is another." Jason's face reddened, but he nodded. "You're right. I want to do better, and I want to help. I don't know how, but maybe there's something I can do for you, or for Max." Peter hesitated. He wasn't sure if he could trust Jason yet. But there was something earnest in his voice. "You really want to help?" "I do," Jason said firmly. "I owe it to you, and to Max." Peter thought for a moment. "All right. If you're serious, I need to know more about Max's past. I tried calling the training center, but they wouldn't tell me much. Maybe we can figure it out together." Jason nodded eagerly. "I'll do whatever it takes." The two men exchanged numbers, and over the next few days, Jason threw himself into the task. He scoured the internet for news articles about search and rescue missions involving golden retrievers, hoping to find any mention of Max. He reached out to friends and acquaintances, asking if they knew anyone connected to the field. One evening, Jason came across a blog written by a retired search and rescue handler. The man had detailed several missions he'd been part of, including one in a remote village devastated by an earthquake. As Jason read, his heart began to race. The blog mentioned a golden retriever who had crawled into a collapsed building to find a trapped child, refusing to give up even when the structure began to shift dangerously. The description matched Max perfectly. Jason immediately emailed the blog's author, explaining the situation and asking for more information. Days passed with no response, but Jason refused to give up. He shared the blog with Peter, who listened intently as Jason read it aloud. "That sounds like Max," Peter said quietly. "But if it is, what happened to him after that mission? Why would they retire him?" Jason had no answers, but his determination only grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that uncovering Max's story was the key to making things right, not just with Peter, but with himself. As the days turned into weeks, Peter and Jason began to form an unlikely partnership, united by their shared goal of uncovering the truth. Max remained as steady as ever, his quiet strength a reminder of why they were doing this. But the closer they got to the answers, the more questions arose, and both men couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they uncovered would change everything they thought they knew about Max, about themselves, and about the bond between humans and the animals who stand by their side through it all. Jason's persistence finally paid off when he received an email reply from the retired search and rescue handler whose blog he had found. The message was brief but enough to send Jason's heart racing. "Jason, I remember Maxwell. He was one of the best dogs I'd ever worked with, but his story is complicated. If you're serious about learning the truth, we need to talk in person. Call me at this number." Jason wasted no time. After a quick call to Peter to update him, he dialed the number in the email. A gruff but kind voice answered, introducing himself as Frank, the blog's author and Max's former handler. "Max is with you," Frank asked, his voice softening as Jason explained the situation. "He's Peter's guide dog now," Jason replied. I'm just trying to help figure out what happened to him. Peter deserves to know. Frank sighed heavily. Max was more than just a dog to me. He was my partner, my friend. What happened to him, it still haunts me. If Peter's ready to hear it, I'll tell you both, but it's not an easy story. Jason arranged for Frank to meet with him and Peter the next day. When he shared the news, Peter was both nervous and eager. For years, Max had been his rock, his constant companion in a world of darkness. But now, Peter felt like he barely knew him. The following afternoon, Jason and Peter waited at a small cafe, Max sitting obediently by Peter's side. When Frank arrived, his weathered face broke into a bittersweet smile as he saw the dog he had once trusted with his life. Max, Frank said, kneeling down to greet him. Max sniffed at the man's outstretched hand, then wagged his tail faintly, as if recognizing an old friend. "He remembers you," Peter said softly, his voice tinged with wonder. Frank nodded, his eyes misty. Dogs like Max never forget. Once they were seated, Frank took a deep breath, his expression serious. Max was trained for the toughest missions. He was fearless, loyal, and smart as a whip. But the mission that changed everything, that one was different. Peter leaned forward, hanging on every word. What happened? Frank hesitated before speaking. It was an earthquake in a remote area overseas. The devastation was unimaginable. Entire villages flattened, people buried alive. Max and I were sent in with a team to search for survivors. On the third day, we got word that a school had collapsed with children trapped inside. Max was the only one small enough to crawl through the debris to reach them. Jason and Peter were silent, their breaths shallow as they listened. Max found them. Frank continued, his voice trembling. 3 children huddled together, terrified. He stayed with them, barking to guide us to their location. But as we worked to get them out, the building started to shift. I called for Max to come back, but he wouldn't leave the kids. He kept nudging them, keeping them calm, even as the walls around him began to crumble. Frank paused, his hands trembling slightly. We got the children out, but Max, he barely made it. A beam collapsed right as he was crawling out, pinning him. It took hours to free him, and by the time we did, he was badly injured. Broken ribs, deep cuts, internal damage. The vets weren't sure he'd survive. Peter's hand tightened on Max's harness, his throat tight. But he did. He did, Frank said with a faint smile. Because he's a fighter, but he wasn't the same after that. The vets said he could never return to search and rescue work. The trauma, both physical and emotional, was too great. That's when the decision was made to retire him and train him as a guide dog. I never wanted to let him go, but I knew he needed a new purpose, a new partner. And that's how he found you, Peter. Peter reached down to stroke Max's head, his voice thick with emotion. You've been through so much, haven't you, buddy? Max leaned into Peter's touch, his eyes calm but filled with a depth that seemed to reflect everything he'd endured. Jason, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. Frank, why didn't anyone tell Peter about this? Why keep it a secret? Frank sighed. It wasn't meant to be a secret. But guide dog organizations focus on the present and the future, not the past. They didn't want to burden Peter with Max's history, thinking it might be too much. But looking at the two of you now, I can see that was a mistake. You deserve to know Peter. Max's story is part of who he is. Peter nodded, his mind spinning. The dog he had thought of as simply his guide, his protector, was so much more. Max was a hero who had risked everything to save lives, and he had carried those scars, both seen and unseen, into his new life as Peter's companion. But just as Peter was beginning to process the weight of Max's story, Frank's expression darkened. There's something else, he said. Something I didn't tell you yet. Jason and Peter exchanged a glance, their curiosity piqued, and a sense of unease settling over them. Before Max was retired, Frank said slowly, there were people, powerful people, who wanted to use dogs like him for other purposes. Military experiments, training programs that went far beyond search and rescue. Max was almost taken from us, Peter. He was almost lost to something far darker. Peter's heart pounded in his chest. What do you mean? Are you saying someone trying to take him? Frank nodded grimly. And those people don't give up easily. Even now, I can't be sure they've stopped looking. The weight of Frank's words hung in the air, filling the small cafe with a sense of foreboding. Peter's grip on Max's harness tightened, his mind racing. The idea that someone might want to take Max away from him was unthinkable. Jason, his jaw clenched, leaned forward. If that's true, then we need to be ready. Whatever happens, we're not letting anyone hurt Max. Frank looked at them both, his eyes filled with both determination and fear. Max has always been a fighter, but this fight might be the hardest yet. The tension in the room was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. Peter, Jason, and Frank were united by their resolve, but the question remained. Who was after Max, and how far were they willing to go to get him? The cafe felt colder after Frank's revelation, as though the gravity of his words had seeped into the very air. Peter's mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the new danger with the life he'd built alongside Max. Jason was the first to break the silence, his voice low but firm. So, who are these people? What do they want with Max now? He's not part of their world anymore. Frank shook his head, his expression troubled. That's the thing. It's not just about Max. Dogs like him, with his level of intelligence, resilience, and loyalty. They're rare. To some, he's not just a guide dog or a retired rescuer. He's a blueprint, proof that animals can be pushed beyond their limits to achieve extraordinary things. But that's the problem. They don't see the toll it takes, the pain it leaves behind. Peter felt a surge of protectiveness as he glanced down at Max, who was lying quietly by his side, seemingly oblivious to the tension. But he's not a tool, Peter said, his voice trembling with emotion. He's not something they can just take and use. Frank nodded. I agree. But these people, they don't think like you or me. To them, it's not about Max as an individual. It's about what he represents. If they could track him down, they'd find a way to justify it. That's why we have to be careful. Jason leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. How do they even know where he is? I mean, it's been years since he left that world, right? What would make them come looking now? Frank hesitated, his gaze flickering to Peter. That's the part I don't know. But someone must have noticed something. Maybe from the records, or maybe someone saw Max in action as a guide dog and connected the dots. Either way, it doesn't matter. If they think he's worth pursuing, they'll keep coming. The weight of Frank's words pressed heavily on Peter's chest. He had always known Max was special, but he had never imagined it would make him a target. As much as Peter wanted to believe they were safe, the undercurrent of fear was impossible to ignore. Jason, always the one to act, pulled out his phone. We need to find out who these people are and what they're planning. If we know what we're up against, we can figure out how to protect Max. Frank shook his head. It's not that simple. These aren't people who operate out in the open. They're careful, deliberate. If you start digging, you could put yourself at risk too. Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. So what? Are we supposed to just sit here and wait for them to come for him? Peter's voice cut through the tension, quiet but resolute. No, we don't wait. We take precautions, stay alert. Max has been through worse than this, and so have I. If they come, we'll be ready. Frank studied Peter for a long moment, his expression softening. You're stronger than most people I know, Peter. But this isn't just about being strong. It's about being smart. If you're going to fight this, you need to do it on your terms, not theirs. As they continued to discuss their next steps, Max stirred, lifting his head and sniffing the air. His ears twitched, and he let out a soft growl, so low that Peter barely heard it. What is it, Max? Peter asked, his hand instinctively moving to the harness. Max stood, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the cafe's entrance. Peter couldn't see what Max had noticed, but the sudden shift in the dog's demeanor sent a shiver down his spine. Jason turned toward the door, his eyes scanning the room. "There's a guy outside," he murmured. "He's just standing there watching us." Frank's expression darkened. "What does he look like?" "Mid-40s, dark jacket, sunglasses," Jason said quietly. "He doesn't look like he's here for coffee." Peter's grip on Max's harness tightened as his heart began to race. "Do you think it's them?" Frank's voice was steady but firm. "I don't know, but we're not taking any chances. Let's go out the back." They moved quickly, Jason leading the way and Frank helping Peter navigate the narrow hallway that led to the cafe's rear exit. Max stayed close, his body alert, his every movement purposeful. As they stepped into the alley, the cool air hit them like a splash of water. Jason glanced over his shoulder, checking to see if they'd been followed. The alley was empty, but the tension was palpable. "We need to get out of here," Frank said, his voice low. "If that guy was watching us, he might not be alone." Jason nodded. "I've got my car parked a block away. Let's move." The group hurried down the alley, their footsteps echoing the quiet space. Max stayed at Peter's side, his movements smooth and confident despite the growing unease. But just as they reached the end of the alley, Jason stopped abruptly, his body blocking the others from moving forward. "What is it?" Frank asked, his voice tense. Jason didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with urgency. "There's another guy. He's at the corner, talking into a headset. I think he's waiting for backup." Peter's stomach churned as he realized the danger they were in. They were being hunted, and the net was closing in. Frank pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly as he dialed a number. "We're not going to make it far on foot. I'm calling someone I trust. We need to get somewhere safe fast." As Frank spoke into the phone, Jason turned to Peter.
"Yes,
His
I do,"
expression
Jason
serious.
said firmly.
"I'll keep an eye out.
I got us into this.
If they try to follow
I'm not
us,
letting them take
I'll slow
Max.
them down."
Frank ended
Peter
his
shook
call.
his head and turned back to
"You
the
don't
group.
have to do that.
"Help is on the way, but we need to hold out until they get here." The alley felt narrower, the walls closing in as the tension reached a breaking point. Max's growl rumbled softly, a warning that the danger was far from over. Peter's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. They were being hunted by people who saw Max as a prize, not a living being. But Max wasn't just a dog. He was family, a hero, a survivor. And Peter would do whatever it took to keep him safe. The sound of footsteps echoed from the other end of the alley, growing louder with each passing second. Frank's voice was calm but urgent. "They're here. Stay close and don't look back." As the group prepared to make their next move, the stakes had never been higher. Max's past had caught up with him, and the fight for his future was just beginning. The alley seemed to stretch endlessly as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Peter's grip on Max's harness was tight, his heart racing with fear and determination. Jason glanced behind them, his eyes narrowing as two figures emerged from the shadows, their movements deliberate and calculated. Frank's phone vibrated in his hand, and he answered it with urgency. "They're here," Frank whispered into the phone. "We need that right now." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. 2 minutes. Hold tight." Peter could feel Max tense at his side, the dog's sharp instincts kicking in. Despite the tension, Max remained calm, his steady presence grounding Peter in the chaos. Jason took a step forward, placing himself between the group and their pursuers. "Keep moving," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I'll slow them down." Frank hesitated, Jason don't. But Jason had already stepped into the path of the two men, raising his hands in a casual gesture that belied the seriousness of the situation. "Hey there," Jason called out, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Lost fellas, you're in the wrong place." The men exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. One of them stepped forward, his voice cold. "We're not here for you. Move aside." Jason didn't budge. "Yeah, see, that's not going to work for me. You want to get through, you're going to have to go through me first." Frank grabbed Peter's arm, urging him toward the far end of the alley. "Come on, we don't have time." Peter hesitated, his heart twisting as he watched Jason confront the strangers. "We can't just leave him." "He knows what he's doing," Frank said firmly. "We need to get Max out of here." Max let out a soft growl, his body pressed against Peter's leg. Peter nodded reluctantly, allowing Frank to guide him towards safety. Jason's voice echoed behind them as he continued to distract the men. "So, what's the deal with you guys? You look like you're dressed for a spy movie. Is that headset standard issue, or do you just like looking important?" One of the men stepped closer, his patience clearly wearing thin. But before he could respond, a loud engine roared to life, echoing through the alley. A black SUV screeched to a stop at the far end, its headlights cutting through the darkness. "That's our ride," Frank said, his voice urgent. "Come on." Peter and Max hurried toward the vehicle, the driver leaning out of the window and waving them over. As they reached the SUV, the driver jumped out, opening the back door. "Get in." Frank helped Peter inside, while Max leaped effortlessly into the seat beside him. As the SUV doors slammed shut, Peter turned to see Jason sprinting toward them, the two men in pursuit. "Go," Jason shouted as he reached the car. The driver didn't hesitate, slamming on the gas as Jason barely managed to dive inside. The SUV sped away, leaving the two men behind in a cloud of dust. For a moment, the only sound inside the vehicle was the heavy breathing of its occupants. Peter reached down to stroke Max's head, the dog's calm presence a reassuring reminder that they were still together. "Is everyone okay?" the driver asked, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. "We're fine," Frank said, his voice steady despite the tension. "But we can't let our guard down. They'll be back." Jason, catching his breath, shook his head. "Who were those guys? They didn't look like random thugs." Frank's expression was grim. "They're not. They're part of a private organization that's been pushing the boundaries of animal training and experimentation. They've been after dogs like Max for years." Peter's voice was quiet but firm. "Why now? Why come after him now, after all this time?" Frank hesitated, his gaze shifting to Max. "Because they didn't just want Max for what he could do. They wanted him for what he knows." Frank interrupted, Peter frowned,
gently.
confused. Max was trained to do more than just search and rescue. How could he? He was part of a program that tested dogs' abilities to recognize patterns, understand human behavior, and even respond to coded commands. He's not just any dog, Peter. He's living proof that their methods worked. The words hung in the air, the implications sinking in. Max wasn't just a hero or a guide dog. He was a key to something much larger, something people were willing to fight for. As the SUV turned onto a quieter street, the tension began to ease, but Peter couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't safe yet. And then, as they approached an intersection, the driver suddenly hit the brakes, the vehicle screeching to a halt. "What's wrong?" Jason asked, his voice sharp. The driver pointed ahead, his face pale. Blocking the road was another black SUV, identical to their own. The doors opened, and several men stepped out, their expressions cold and focused. Frank cursed under his breath. They were waiting for us. Peter's heart pounded as he realized there was no way out. Max growled softly, his body tense and ready. Jason glanced around the car, his mind racing. But then, as the men approached, something unexpected happened. Max barked sharply, a single, commanding sound that seemed to cut through the chaos. The men froze, their expressions shifting to surprise and uncertainty. Frank's eyes widened. What's he doing? Peter tightened his grip on Max's harness. I don't know, but it's like he's trying to tell them something. Max barked again, then moved to the door, pawing at it insistently. Peter hesitated, unsure of what to do. Let him out, Frank said suddenly. Trust him. With shaking hands, Peter opened the door. Max jumped out, his posture confident and commanding. The men watched him, their movements hesitant, as if unsure how to react. And then, to everyone's shock, Max walked straight up to the leader of the group and sat at his feet, staring up at him with an intensity that seemed almost human. The man hesitated, his expression conflicted. Then slowly he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. With the press of a button, a red light blinked once before fading. "They're standing down," Frank said in disbelief. Peter stared in awe as the men retreated to their vehicle, leaving without a word. Max trotted back to Peter's side, his tail wagging slightly as if nothing had happened. "What just happened?" Jason asked, his voice filled with wonder. Frank shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Max happened. Whatever they wanted, he made them think twice. He's always been one step ahead of the rest of us." As they drove away, the danger finally behind them, Peter looked down at Max, his heart filled with gratitude and awe. Max had protected him once again, proving that he was more than just a guide dog. He was a true hero. But even as they celebrated their escape, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that Max's story wasn't over. There were still secrets buried in his past, and the journey to uncover them had only just begun.